everyone. Good morning. I wanted to thank everyone for coming here today. It's a great way to start off your morning, and hopefully we'll have a great conversation, and we're going to have some remarks from the senator here. Before we get underway, I want to remind everyone that this conversation is on the record. It is being broadcast as well, and we will give you all a chance, hopefully all, to ask some questions after we finish the question and answer period up here, and we'll have some microphones for you. I'm sure you've all seen these and been to them before, so you're old hands at that. But this is, of course, Angus King, who's going to give us a sense of why he wants to talk right now about Iran, this nuclear deal that has been signed, and his concern about implementation and follow-through and some challenges to it. I'm Margaret Brennan from CBS News. I'm also a term member here at the Council on Foreign Relations. So I'm excited to be doing this conversation, my first one as a member. But I cover foreign policy for CBS News and national security. So you'll see me on the road often in places like Geneva with deals like this being negotiated. But without further ado, just to introduce the conversation once again, I want to ask the senator to give us a sense of his thoughts and why we're here today. Angus King, of course, an independent from Maine on armed services, on intelligence, and has a lot to say about this.
Great. Thanks, Margaret. Margaret didn't tell you, but she just got back from Geneva, so I appreciate your joining us today. What I'd like to do before we get to hopefully a lot of questions, and this is a story that's changing by the day, is first start with a little bit about who am I, since this is my first visit with this group. The first thing in terms of where we are is that my hometown is Alexandria, Virginia. Although I'm a senator from Maine, I grew up in Alexandria. My granddad was the mayor of Alexandria in the 20s, and I went to Maine in 1969 out of Virginia Law School to join Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. I was with some of you remember the OEO and the Legal Services Corporation, and I was assigned to Maine. Being from Virginia, when I got to Maine, I had a son born in 1970 in the Skowhegan, Maine hospital, and I learned at that time how hard it is to be from Maine. Because after my son was born, I was so excited I went out on the street and said, I ran into an old farmer friend of mine, Charles Forbes. I said, Mr. Forbes, guess what? I have a son just born in the Skowhegan Hospital. He's a native of Maine. And the old farmer looked at me over his glasses and says, well, by golly, just because the cat has her kittens in the oven, don't make them biscuits. So I learned at that moment that you can't be from Maine even if you've been born there. Went to Dartmouth College. By the way, there are 4 senators from Dartmouth in the United States Senate right now. I think the largest delegation from any one college, Rob Portman, Kristen Gillibrand, John Hoeven, and myself, University of Virginia Law School. We have 3 senators from Virginia Law School, Sheldon Whitehouse and Bill Nelson, who was there when I was. Then went to Maine, as I said, worked for Pine Tree Legal Assistance in rural Maine. Then had an interesting experience, which is relevant to what I'm doing now. I came back to Washington for 2.5 years and worked as a staff member in the U.S. Senate. I was sworn in as a United States Senator 40 years to the day from the day I entered service as a staff member of the Senate in January of 1973. So that's a rich area of discussion in itself, is what the Senate, how the Senate and the Congress has changed during that period. It's really fascinating. For example, I remember going to conference committees pretty regularly in those days. Now a conference committee, I think there were 2 or maybe 3 in the last year. Practiced law in Maine, went into business, was in the renewable energy business really for most of my adult life. Hydropower, biomass, energy conservation, wind power, and spent a lot of time in the energy business. And then was governor of Maine for 8 years in the 90s and into 2002 as an independent. And then retired from politics. Taught at Bowdoin and Bates colleges, worked on some boards, did a variety of things, had no intention or expectation of ever getting back into politics or ever running for anything. And then in February of 2012, Olympia Snowe, to everyone's shock and surprise, announced her retirement. Basically because she said, I'm just sick and tired of the Senate and the Congress not working. And I thought, well, maybe I can make a contribution as an independent and try to make the institution work a little bit better. So that was the beginning of my re-entry into politics in the spring of 2012. I was elected in November of 2012 and started in the Senate last year as the world's oldest freshman. And was appointed, of course, you know, my intention was to be a pure independent. Chris Matthews, I was on hardball. Chris said, by the way, if you're ever, when you're with Chris, he interviews himself, really. And you're there, you're sort of the wallpaper. But he said, Angus, why don't you just put your chair in the middle and be a real independent? Don't join any parties, caucuses, everything. Well, that was fine until I found out you don't get committee assignments except through the caucus. So I joined the Democratic caucus and was appointed to Armed Services, Rules, Budget, and to prove Harry Reid has a sense of humor, Intelligence. And those are the committees, ironically, which ended up putting me right in the center of everything that went on last year. Syria, the budget, Iran, NSA, Snowden, all of those issues I've been up to my elbows in right from the very beginning. And that brings us to today, which I wanted to talk for a few minutes about Iran. The story is changing literally as we sit here. This morning, there's a Reuters report that the advocates for the new sanctions bill are talking about backing off and having another kind of bill, but not necessarily new sanctions. So all my carefully written objections to why we shouldn't do sanctions may be moot as of this morning. But I want to talk generally about the situation and about the sanctions bill because, you know, things can change on a sort of day-to-day basis. Just before the break last week, I talked to one of the senior senators about this issue, and his comment was, well, we may back off, but if the Iranian economy improves over the next 6 months, then we'll be back. That was sort of his standard for what was going on. So I think it's a very fluid situation. As you know, 59 senators sponsored S-1881, or co-sponsored it, which was the new sanctions bill sponsored by Senator Menendez. And there was a report over the weekend that they felt they had 75 votes if it actually came to the floor, which would have made it veto-proof. A similar bill passed the House last summer before the announcement of the interim agreement, so that's a different kind of situation. But still, I don't think there's any doubt that there's substantial interest in this issue and substantial interest in the possibility of additional sanctions. You all know the issue. The basic issue is what's Congress's role in this process while negotiations are underway with regard to Iran. And I'm going to walk through that, although it's a funny situation. I developed this position thinking about this issue, talking to people like Carl Levin and Dianne Feinstein and others who I really respect on these kinds of issues back in December. And at the time, my position, which was opposed to the bill, I was an outlier and a contrarian because all the momentum was in the direction of the sanctions. And then over the course of the last several weeks, the momentum seems to have shifted, and the push for new sanctions, as I mentioned, even as recently as this morning, seems to have diminished. I feel good about that. I don't take responsibility for it, but I can tell you that I and others talked to other members of various caucuses about this issue. And I have to say, I think one of the key moments was a week ago on a Thursday when the Democratic caucus went to the White House to meet with the president. closed-door meeting, no press. There was very little staff there, and there were a variety of issues. There wasn't any agenda, and the president was talking about the minimum wage and the economy and middle class and all that. And one of the senators asked him about Iran. And he was the most powerful and persuasive I have ever seen him on any subject, on why it would be a mistake to move forward with additional sanctions or even additional sanctions triggered later as were proposed by the Menendez bill. I mean, I sat there and thought, I don't know how anybody can sit in this room and feel that this is the right course given his really eloquent, no notes, no teleprompter, no anything, just sitting on a stool, a really powerful statement about, you know, the history of how we got here and what we should do. And I think that probably had something to do with some of the steam coming out of this, this issue. Not that people were saying we've got to do this because we got to be loyal to the president, but I think because he was just downright persuasive. And I think that does occasionally happen around here. And I think this was a case where it did. But I feel a little funny because I took a position and the world changed. I still have the same position. Some of you remember Mort Sahl from the 50s, the comedian. Mort Sahl once said, if you maintain a consistent political opinion in this country long enough, you will eventually be tried for treason. And you know, I sort of felt like I stayed the same and everything sort of shifted. Some important things about the sanctions. We've had sanctions against Iran since 1979 in one way, shape, or form. But the sanctions that have really bitten, the sanctions that have really changed the face of the Iranian economy are those that went into effect around 2009, 2010 and involved the rest of the world. Iranian oil exports have gone from 2.5 million barrels a day to 1. That's about a 60% reduction. 100% of that reduction is because of reduced purchases by other countries, not by the U.S. The EU reduced their purchases 600,000 barrels a day. China, Japan, India. So it's really important to realize that the sanctions that are biting are the international coalition sanctions, not simply U.S. sanctions. Now, we've provoked a lot of those by pressure on our allies. There's no question that we've led it. But I think it's really important to realize that unilateral sanctions from the U.S. aren't necessarily going to be the way to change Iranian policy. The results have really been significant. I mentioned the oil, 100 billion to 30 billion of revenue in oil revenue. 50% inflation, 20% unemployment, 5% contraction last year in the Iranian GDP. This is the effect that it's had, and it's really been significant. And as you know, a new president was elected, and the platform that he had was economic improvement. Sounds familiar. I mean, you run for president, you say, we're going to have more jobs, the economy is going to improve. But he came to the realization that the sanctions were a significant part of the problem, and he had a more open attitude toward trying to modify them. So, where are we? You all know. We've got a 6-month interim agreement with some very significant, I reread it this morning, there's a good summary on whitehouse.gov. If you do whitehouse.gov summary of sanctions, you get the whole long list of what they have to do and what we do in terms of the giving up of the easing up on the about $7 billion worth of value over the 6 months, and it's a pretty impressive piece of negotiation. The value isn't all given on day one, it's parceled out over a period of time, and the sanctions, the changes in or the imposition on the Iranian nuclear program are really quite significant. Talk about dilution of the 20% enriched, no more 5% enriched, restrictions on the Arak reactor, a lot of other detailed restrictions, but probably most importantly, extraordinary new transparency and access. And that's a key part of this, more than we've ever had before. And the real question is, will they do it? And because this is a project that is in at least 2 steps, maybe more, but at least 2 steps, we have an opportunity to test the Iranians' good faith, to test whether they are in fact going to live up to the commitments made in this interim agreement. And the terms of the interim agreement really cause a pause in their ability to reach breakout in terms of a nuclear weapon. So it's a pretty solid piece of work in terms of the effects on the Iranians and particularly the transparency to see whether they're honoring the commitments. It also is worth mentioning that the oil sanctions don't change, that that's not part of the deal. The sanctions that have limited the sale of oil are exactly the same. There's not no opening up. Now, the proponents for the bill, S. 1881, make a plausible case. If sanctions have gotten us this far, won't more sanctions get us further? If you strengthen the sanctions, it'll strengthen the president's hand. It'll give him a stronger hand to negotiate, and we'll have a stronger agreement at the end. You know, that makes sense. It will get a better deal. And besides, we can't trust the Iranians. And, you know, Reagan said trust but verify. I think in this case it's verify but verify. I mean, there's a lot of history here, and I don't think trust really is necessarily part of the equation. It has to be verify and verify. And I want to pause right now. Just to, my notes say humility. Nobody knows how these things are going to play out. Nobody knows what's going to happen over the next 6 months or over the next couple of years. It's a very unpredictable situation. So I'm standing here with great assurance giving you my position, but I don't guarantee being right. And I don't think anybody can take that position. I think when you're talking about foreign policy, humility is an important quality to realize the challenges of predicting, particularly when you're predicting what another country and another culture, another political system is going to do. But the argument is, let's strengthen the president's hand, let's get a better deal. I just don't think that works. And I think the Congress, and maybe this is old news as of this morning, but the idea of imposing new sanctions now I think is just not useful. And I think it would have exactly the opposite effect of that which is desired. One effect might well be the Iranians just plain walk. That the hardliner, I mean, I wrote a little piece with Carl Levin, and we said that theory would work if Iran was a politics-free zone. But Iran has internal politics just like the US or Great Britain or Germany or anywhere else, and there are people in Iran who don't like these conversations. They don't want to give up any part of the nuclear program. They're very reluctant to give up what they consider something important to their national pride and perhaps national survival. So if we change the goalposts, if we say we're going to, by the way, put in new sanctions, and by the way, the interim agreement has a specific provision that says no new sanctions. So we would be in violation of that interim agreement if we impose new sanctions. It could be argued, well, if they trigger 6 months, does that count? I'm not sure that subtlety would translate very well into Farsi. The headline in Tehran would be U.S. Congress imposes new sanctions. And my concern is that would empower the hardliners to say, I told you so, you can't trust the Americans, we're walking away from this. And this is the best chance we've had in a decade or more to do something about this very serious issue of Iran having nuclear weapons. So I worry about the hardliners, even with a delayed trigger, and that it would undercut Rouhani and take away his ability to make a deal. He's got to play to his political base, and of course the supreme leader in Iran has immense input on this. The second reason I think it's a bad idea is that, again, to go back to what I mentioned, these sanctions work because of the support of the international community. And if we impose new sanctions and the international, the coalition, the partners that are involved in the sanctions say, well, we wanted this interim agreement, it tends to weaken their support for the sanctions, which ironically could end up leading to weaker sanctions in the end. We would end up worse than we started off because the real power of the sanctions comes from the support of the international community. I think Congress has an important role. I think Congress has an important role being the sword in the sheath, if you will. But you don't have to bear the sword. Everybody knows, the Iranians know that Congress is ready to impose new sanctions, is discussing it, is actively thinking about it. But if they pass it and then the president has to veto it, I think it makes a very difficult situation for our negotiators. And the Iranians say, well, who does speak for the U.S. government? We have this agreement that went into effect last week, but it's been abrogated, 2 weeks later. Who are we negotiating with here? Maybe we should, instead of talking to the president or the Secretary of State, we should talk to Harry Reid and Bob Menendez or John Boehner. I mean, I think it raises a legitimate question about who speaks for the United States. So I think Congress has an important role, but I don't think it's to come in and raise a question about who speaks for the United States government. I think finally this is a pretty simple question of risk analysis for me. What's the upside and what's the downside? I see very little upside to passing a bill of this nature now. It may strengthen the president's hand, maybe. That's the possible upside. But the downside I view as enormous. If they walk, if the talks end, if the sanction coalition falls apart, we may have missed a once-in-a-generation opportunity to deal with this problem. And the final point is there aren't many options to deal with the problem of a potentially nuclear-armed Iran. One is negotiation, and the other is military action. The third, I suppose, is to tolerate a nuclear-armed Iran, but nobody seems to want to consider that as an option, and I don't think it should be, but that leaves military force. And maybe negotiations could start again under different circumstances, and we could tighten the noose of sanctions, but we've got this opportunity in front of us. The agreements in the interim agreement are pretty significant. They're not token. And we have an opportunity to test the Iranians' good faith, to test their ability to allow access, to test their ability to actually take concrete steps to step away from nuclear arms. And I don't see much downside, particularly since there's a pause in their development of capability to break out, to allowing this process to play out over the next 6 to 12 months. There are going to be ups and downs. There's going to be posturing on both sides. There's going to be difficult negotiations. And of course, the ultimate question will be, what does the final deal look like? And is it something that we really want to, is it good enough to satisfy us and our allies that we've prevented this, the nuclear armament of Iran? But that's going to be part of the discussion over the next 6 months. So my view is, as I've certainly made clear, that we have an opportunity here and we shouldn't let it slip away. Ronald Reagan said a very interesting thing. He said, peace is not the absence of conflict. There will always be conflict in the world. But peace is the ability to cope with conflict by peaceful means. And I think we're in a moment now where we have an opportunity to cope with conflict by peaceable means. And I certainly hope that we seize it, and I hope that the Congress is able to play a constructive role in this process. So I hope I've given you some food for thought, and now we'll have a conversation. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity.
Senator, I should have led with you went to University of Virginia Law School.
Yes.
Because I'm a UVA grad.
Oh, you are?
Wahoo-wah.
Good for you. Wow.
Key element there in your bio. I want to follow up on some of what you're talking about. Just to clarify, it sounds like you believe momentum is slowing on the Hill in terms of this threat to impose new sanctions. Is this bill really on ice?
Well, things change day to day, but I would say based on the story this morning, based on comments I'm getting on the floor, the momentum has slowed in terms of bringing it forward. I don't see the sponsors withdrawing it or anything like that. My guess is, and you know, we're all going, literally, this is a Reuters report this morning that a new version is being drafted that doesn't necessarily involve new sanctions, but will involve some language, you know, keeping the pressure on the administration. So if I had to bet right now, I would think that it probably won't come to the floor anytime soon, but I don't have that directly from Harry Reid, but that's my impression.
You talked about a change leading to this probably happening around last week. Last week's also when this deal went into effect, last Monday. To a certain extent, maybe this is a cynical view or a cynical posture to pose here.
A member of the press, cynical?
I'm a paid cynic. So when you look at the timing here, hasn't Congress's role really been tactical pressure for the administration? Because these technical details have been worked out in the past few weeks before the agreement went into effect on Monday.
I think the pressure has helped, for sure. Somebody said that this is a bill that's better threatened than passed. And I think to some extent that was the case. The momentum started to change, I think, when people like Dianne Feinstein went to the floor and made a very strong speech against it. Carl Levin, who's been very strong on Iran and these issues. And then some of the people in this audience who've made statements, and Jessica Matthews' story in the New York Review of Books. I think a lot of people have been sort of saying, wait a minute, slow down, what would be the effect here? Because at the beginning it was, let's go, and they got 59 co-sponsors in a matter of weeks, and then it kind of stopped.
So you're on the Intelligence Committee, you've received briefings on what's actually in this deal. Does this extend Iran's breakout time, the time it takes for them to actually build a weapon? I've
got to be really careful and remember what I know in what context and what I can talk about. But I think it's public knowledge that the terms that cause the dilution of the 20% enriched, the freezing of the 5%, in effect the freezing of the construction of the Iraq reactor, does delay the breakout time to some extent. The other piece of intelligence, and I've seen both classified and unclassified, but the unclassified is the intelligence community does believe that additional sanctions now would, there's a, I can't remember, high likelihood that the Iranians would walk. So there's an intelligence basis for that concern because of internal politics in Iran.
One of the other things you talked about in your remarks there was not just the Iranians walking, but part of the alliance breaking up. Is that code for Russia would walk? Russia would start violating these sanctions, China would?
That wasn't my intention. I don't know I don't know who might break off, but it's not. I think there's some fragility, and I don't know who it would be. But some of these countries that are backing off of their purchases, it's at some cost to them. It isn't something that they were thrilled to do. And so, I don't know whether, I couldn't say whether, Russia is less a player on the oil front because they don't purchase much oil. The EU and China and India are the biggest that changed that equation. The other piece, and Mr. Pollack, what's his first name? Ken Pollack, wrote a good piece that, in a sense, we have the high ground now. We're negotiating, and if there's a breach, it's on the Iranians. If we flip that and impose new sanctions in violation of the interim agreement, we lose the high ground, and it gives our partners more of a chance to walk. He argues that the most powerful reason not to do this is the breakup of the coalition.
So with these 6 months, that time that's been purchased essentially, you say that has extended the breakout time. What's gained over that? I mean, what happens at the end of the 6 months?
Well, that's going to be a big question, and I think one of the questions that has to be considered is what is success? What's the definition of success? Some of our allies want success to be no nuclear capacity at all, no enrichment capacity at all. The indications from Iran is that they're not going to accept that. So the question is, what between 0 and something is going to be acceptable in the agreement, and there are going to be all kinds of other pieces to it in terms of reactors and centrifuges and parts and inspections and all those kinds of things. There's no certainty here. My position is that if we can have a pause, a slow down of the breakout period, and an opportunity, a chance to get a deal, we ought to take it, because the other options are very unattractive. And the consensus seems to be that if military force was used, the best we could do is delay it. We couldn't necessarily eliminate the capacity, and if we delay it, then we're back in the same box at some period. Plus, if there are airstrikes, whoever does them, it seems to me the chances that they would then forswear the development of nuclear weapons go close to 0. They're going to say, we got to have them. These people are bombing us. And so we've accelerated that intention. And right now it's an open question. The intelligence is unclear as to what the supreme leader really wants to do here. He's made statements in the past saying this is inconsistent, nuclear weapons are inconsistent with Islamic law. So I think, in any kind of situation like this where you're making decisions, you've got to say, compared to what? And right now, we've got a promising opportunity, and compared to what? Meaning bombing, delay, almost assured pursuit of a weapon after that. To me, it's a good time to take a deep breath and let it play out.
And when you're talking about breakout time, you're talking about the capacity to build a weapon or the ability to weaponize? Because there seems to be two different definitions there.
Well, I think it's capacity. I take a fairly conservative view on that, in that if they have the capacity to do it in a reasonably short period of time, that's pretty close to being able to do it, and that we really need to be looking for an agreement that limits that capacity.
And so in these negotiations, you think that definition of breakout's been extended. By how much?
I couldn't say. Months. I think, as I view it, and again, there are probably people in this room who are more expert than I am on this, but as I view the interim agreement, it delays breakout by the period of the agreement.
By 6 months.
But it could be 2 months either way. But I don't think, and I think this is a legitimate question, is all this talk just to get a delay to go toward breakout? Is it all just a sham? And the provisions of the interim agreement, I think, are real, and I think do have an effect, assuming they're done. I mean, I think that's a big part of this is it going to be effectuated? Is it going to be implemented? Are they going to meet their commitments? And do they allow the kind of access that they're talking about, daily access instead of every 2 weeks, and instantaneous monitoring? If all of those things occur and we can verify, I think we're not losing anything by providing this time. Now, events could prove me and others totally wrong, and there may be a lab under a mountain somewhere that nobody knows about that, is working away at it. But given the facts as we know it now, I think we need to take this time.
And what level of transparency is there with the Hill right now, with people in the committees you sit on, in terms of that follow-through? How regular will you
Well, we're having,
getting updates?
there's an Intelligence Committee hearing tomorrow on it's the annual Worldwide Threat Assessment, which I know this is going to be a major thrust. It's an open hearing. So we will talk about that undoubtedly, and I've talked to Chairman Feinstein about this. There are going to be closed hearings on Iran, so we have a full briefing on what we know, how we know it, and how transparent the process is. And I think that's one of the most important responsibilities that we have, is to be sure that that's the case, that it's not wishful thinking, that we're not just hoping that they're doing it, because as far as I'm concerned, if it's not verifiable, then it doesn't count. I mean, that's got to be a place where I think Congress keeps its thumb on the administration. And as I mentioned, Congress has a role here. It's just a question of how overt the role is. But I think the pressure on the administration is important. The pressure for verification is important. And, we're going to be continuing to ask the questions.
I do want to get to some questions from the audience. Just one more before I do that, and that is, and this is more of a policy question than one as to your personal views, but do you think any of this actually leads to empowering the moderates in a way, the relative moderates in Iran, that could, in theory, lead to a grand bargain? Is there something more to be gained, or are we purely looking
Grand bargain?
at
I
this?
thought that was with Boehner. I know what you mean.
On Syria and other issues that are also of concern to the administration?
I wish I could say yes. I don't see this linked to Syria. I think Syria is a separate issue. You were just there. Syria is the most complex public policy issue I've ever looked at, with the possible exception of health care. So I don't think there's necessarily a linkage there. I do think, Iran is an ancient civilization, a pretty modern country, and we've been estranged from them since '79, and no, there's not going to be a normalization of relations overnight by any means, but this could be a step toward opening up of that country somewhat more to the West, and a moderation of their politics. But I don't see regime change anytime soon there, and I think that's an unrealistic expectation.
Well, I do want to get to the audience now. We have microphones. If you would just say your name and affiliation and stand up.
Somebody's got a
Here in
mic.
the front row.
Thank you. Morning. Richard Downey from Delphi Strategic Consulting, and thank you very much for interesting comments and discussion. I wanted to ask you to clarify something you just touched on briefly. You mentioned that the success of the sanctions was really due after 2009, 2010 to the international community really following through on this. And you also mentioned that it's all about verifying. Trust doesn't really work, that we really have to ensure that the Iranians follow through on what they've promised. But when you addressed the Kenneth Pollock article, you just sort of glanced by. I wonder, do you believe that as we move through this process, that the international community will weaken its strength in terms of focusing on this, and can we gather that same kind of power in sanctions later on if the Iranians do renege on what they promised to do?
That's a very good question, and I think there is concern that opening the door to the easing of the sanctions can create a slippery slope, and it's going to be very hard to put it back together. I think if you focus, though, on what exactly the opening of the door is, it's pretty limited. It's not a change in the oil limitations, for example. It's of the $7 billion of sanctions relief, 4.5 or 4.2 is the freeing up of Iranian frozen assets that they from their oil from previous years. So it's not that there's this huge opening, although I have heard that there's a lot of interest in Tehran. There are a lot of foreign companies that are trying to get ready to do business and those kinds of things. And I think that's something that we have to keep an eye on. But if the question is, what makes the international coalition sticking together more or less likely? My sense is that us imposing additional sanctions now in violation of the interim agreement that they, after all, helped negotiate, would undermine that more than the modest reductions in the sanctions that are going to go over the 6 months. I mean, that's a judgment call, and I think it's a legitimate question, but their commitment, I think, rests at least in part on their view that, hey, we did what you wanted us to do. It's had the effect you wanted. We got to the table. They're making some movement. Let's keep going. And I can't speak for the Chinese or the Japanese and what their motivations are, but that's my sense, is that it's more likely to hold if we honor the interim agreement than the contrary.
But to follow on that, I mean, in Davos last week, we were standing here with Secretary Kerry, and on another stage, Rouhani standing up there saying, Iran's open for business. Come look at what we got. Come see our oil fields. That's a bet that 6 months from now, there's going to be an ability to invest, or that there are enough cracks in the regime to allow for it.
Well, listen, I want them to be motivated to make a good deal. I mean, you got to declare, sometimes you got to declare victory. I mean, if we get a solid, verifiable deal that solves this problem, then we've achieved what we wanted to achieve. The purpose of the sanctions was to keep Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, and that's the goal.
On this side of the room, do we have questions? Then here in the middle, can we run a mic, second row?
Don't have to only talk about Iran, by the way. If you want to talk about the Farm Bill, I can do that.
Well, as a fellow property taxpayer and neighbor in the town of Brunswick, I just want to welcome you
You're a great American.
to the council. Gordon Adams, American University. A couple of quickies. One is I wonder what the advantage, it seems to be a very strong moment that your remarks suggest here, where both sides in this negotiation actually are playing good cop, bad cop. On both sides of this, there is watch out for these conservatives behind me because they're going to derail this agreement if you give them half an opening. And on our side, watch out for these folks over here with sanctions in the Senate because they're going to derail this negotiation. Does that make it more propitious or less propitious to actually get a deal? But it's a curious symmetry there. The other question was, I wanted to push back a little bit on the question of other issues, because there is this broader agenda with Iran, which is support for terrorism and meddling in Syria and meddling in Iraq and other issues that are of importance to it. Could you give us just a little bit more on why you think it makes sense to sort this piece out separately from that broader discussion?
I didn't mean to imply that it should be sorted out. I think what I communicated was that I'm not sure we're going to be able to join them. There's a difference. I'm not saying we should explicitly, if we can settle some of these other issues and do something about, Hezbollah and Hamas and the support for Syria, all the better. And the other export of terrorism and those kinds of things, that would be a great result. I'm just not sure that that's achievable given the scope of what's being discussed. Might be possible. Part of that is going to depend upon how the international partners feel about those other issues and whether they're willing to stick with some level of sanctions in order to achieve a larger result. Your comment about both sides have I liken it to a used car deal where there's always a guy upstairs. You negotiate with the salesman, and he says, well, I'm not sure, I got to check with the guy upstairs, who I've never been sure whether that person really exists. But that's a common function in any negotiation. And I think clearly the president's hand is strengthened by the fact that Congress is behind the curtain here, and everybody knows that they're prepared to move forward. For example, if the deal doesn't get to the proper place, if there's a lack of verification, I can tell you it's not going to take long for that bill to come to the floor. I mean, if Harry Reid says it's coming to the floor, it's going to come to the floor, and it's going to get you know, solid support. But so I do think that the people in the background do have an important role to play. I often have thought of going back, you know, to Vietnam and you know, foreign policy in the last 50 years. One of the fundamental mistakes we as Americans make is to assume that everybody else in the world thinks like we do. That they don't. They have different cultures. They have different values. And you know, I can remember in college hearing speeches from the Bundys about this rational policy in Vietnam and how we were going to squeeze them and ratchet it up, and they were going to have to give in. And I remember George Mitchell talking about Saddam, and he was going to have to give in because his economy shrunk by 0.2%. It just doesn't necessarily work that way. And so I think we have to understand and try to put ourselves into the shoes of this other society in terms of what's going to be possible. But you know, this moment of a nuclear Iran, and one of the Jessica Matthews makes the point that usually when one country in a region goes nuclear, they do it in clumps. And if Iran develops a weapon, Saudi Arabia and Turkey and perhaps Egypt are going to feel like they have to. And then then we've got it's 1914 all over again with nuclear weapons, and the Middle East is the Balkans of this century. So this is a really important moment, and all the dynamics that are in play. But the key thing is we're talking for the first time in 10 years, or 12 years, or in reality 34 years, 35 years. And we just can't let this moment slip away. I used to teach about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and to me, the elements of the Cuban Missile Crisis were four: an existential threat, a credible threat of force, some kind of sanction, which was the quarantine, and negotiations. Put those together and you can solve a problem. And I think this situation is very similar. And if it hadn't, you know, anybody who studies the Cuban Missile Crisis, if they hadn't kept talking, you know, it would have been a disaster. There's no word for it. Catastrophe is too mild a word. And these moments come and go in history. And we've got to seize this one, in my view. Not naively or blindly or, you know, acquiescently, if that's a word, but realistically, with our eyes open, understanding the risks and understanding the importance of verification.
Question here in the front and then here on the side.
Alan Wentz, formerly with the State Department. Senator, in the past, we have been concerned that IAEA inspection procedures in Iran were simply inadequate to detect any violation of Iran's commitments. What's different this time that satisfies us that the inspection procedures will be intrusive enough to detect any Iranian violation?
Well, I don't have a specific sort of intelligence-based answer to that, except that we have a period to test that. I mean, we're going to find out in a matter of weeks how much access they have, how often they can get in, what the monitoring is going to be, what the real-time streaming video monitoring is going to be, what facilities they get to. And I think this is a continuing process. It's not now and 6 months. I think it's a process whereby we can try to determine A, the level of verification, B, whether it's sufficiently rigorous, and C, whether the Iranians are playing straight with it. And at any time along that process, we'll be able to say, wait a minute, this isn't working. So I can't tell you today that they have 42 inspectors where they used to have 24. I don't know that. I do know that inspection is a key part, maybe the most important part of the interim agreement.
Here on the side.
I'm Morton Halperin from the Open Society Foundations. Senator, as you know, the Armed Services Committee on which you sit did a very important study of detainee treatment. And then that report was released and helped educate the American people. And now the Intelligence Committee, on which you also sit, has completed another report. And I wonder whether you support declassifying and releasing that report.
I can give you the answer as of today. Probably, but I'm still not fully convinced. There were some limitations with the Intelligence Committee. This is a study done of torture, basically, and what we did in the early part of this century. There were some limitations of that study. Nobody was interviewed. It was all documentary, and you always get I'm not sure you get a fully accurate picture when you're looking at documents, but don't do interviews with the individuals involved. My judgment is going to be based upon whether I think it will be helpful to the country and to the dialogue. I've seen it. I've read it. Not all 6,000 pages, but I've read a good deal of the substance of it. And my inclination is to vote to release it. But I'm reserving judgment. I'm sure we're going to have a vigorous debate in the committee. Unfortunately, as you may know, the committee broke up on partisan lines, and the Republican members essentially they pulled their staff back from participation. So it wasn't a true joint report, which I think is unfortunate. So I'm going to listen to the debate. I realized about 2 months ago in an Intelligence Committee meeting, I'm the deciding vote. There are 15 members, there are 7 Democrats, 7 Republicans, and me, and we had an amendment on something, and I voted no, and I realized I'd swayed, I decided which way it went. That was a little disconcerting. I killed an amendment by Jay Rockefeller and apologized. He said, that's all right. So I am going to have, I take very seriously this vote, and it's one that as I say, I'm leaning toward yes, but I'm not fully there yet. And the decision for me is, will it contribute to the public dialogue and understanding, or will it distort it and not be an accurate picture? That's where I am. Thank you for the question.
We have time for probably 2 questions. If you could keep them succinct, that'll help us here in front.
Hi, I'm Stephen Coltai from Lincolnville, Maine. I wanted to ask you.
If you're from Lincolnville, Maine, what the hell are you doing here?
I came.
Lincolnville, Maine is one of the most beautiful places on earth.
I came to see you, Senator. Totally different subject. You mentioned that Senator Snowe stepped down because she was frustrated by the partisan politics. We were very proud to elect you as an independent for Maine, and you talked about just now how that's actually come in handy a couple of times. How's it going for you, the bipartisanship on this?
Well, first I should say I'm having a great time. I mean, I just have to admit that. It's frustrating at times, but I told my wife a few weeks ago, I've been preparing for this job all my life, I just didn't know it. And it is frustrating. I mean, but there have been opportunities where we've been able to nudge people, and in fact, the highlight and the low light of last year was the same time, the shutdown. The low point was the shutdown. It was so ridiculous, so avoidable, so predictable, so, harmful. The highlight was we formed this little group with Susan Collins, 14 of us, that actually negotiated a settlement. It was bipartisan. There were 7 Republicans, 6 Democrats, and me. And we negotiated a settlement, and Susan went to Mitch McConnell and said, we've got a deal. And if you and Harry don't work this out and announce something by 3 this afternoon, we're having a press conference. And lo and behold, they finalized their deal. Now, I'm not prepared to take credit for it, but I feel like we did make a contribution to moving that process forward. And here's something really interesting. After that happened, and it got out that we had this little group, we started getting applicants to join. We started hearing from other senators saying, we'd like to join that group. And in fact, we were supposed to have a meeting this morning, but it's been postponed because of an Armed Services Committee meeting. But we're now going to tackle some of these issues of amendments and process and worker and unemployment insurance as trying to work from the center out. If that works, it will have all been worth it. Even the $6 million they spent to try to defeat me. And so, you know, I feel it's still a very partisan place, but the interesting thing is it's not partisan personally. The relationships are there. It's very positive relationships. And so I'm feeling, I'm fired up. It's an amazing, and particularly for somebody who was there as a staff member 40 years ago, I keep expecting somebody to walk onto the floor of the United States Senate and say, "What the hell are you doing here?" You know, people say, "Good morning, Senator," and I do this. It's an amazing experience. And I walk to work, I live east of the Capitol, and I walk to work down Maryland Avenue, and the sun is rising and lighting up the dome of the Capitol, and to look up and see that and say, that's where I get to go to work. It's humbling. It's really an amazing opportunity. So I'm having a good time, mostly. My wife, if she were here, would say, he loves it.
Back of the room, I think there was a question. Here, can we run a mic?
Hello, everybody. Elnaz Kiani from Voice of America. Senator, some opponent of Assad's regime claim that the nuclear deal with Iran caused America's silence against Iran's assistance for the survival of Assad.
For the survival of what? I'm sorry.
Assad regime.
Bashar al-Assad.
How, in your perspective, nuclear deal affect America's position towards Syria?
I haven't seen that. Our reporter Margaret would be a better person to respond because she just came back from Geneva and was with Secretary Kerry. But I haven't heard of any talk of, hey, we're working on this nuclear deal, therefore we're going to take the pressure off Assad. Now, you know, I'm not in these meetings, but I have no knowledge of that being the case. We want, our policy is to get Assad out, to have a transitional government, and to try to do something for the humanitarian catastrophe that's taking place in that country. I was there, Carl Levin and I went in the summer to Turkey and Jordan to the refugee camps, and it's an awful, awful situation. And what the Assad regime does in terms of how their tactic of just bombing a town down to rubble is inhumane in the extremes. But I haven't, in answer to your question, I haven't seen any evidence that there's a linkage, that somehow behind the scenes the deal is we'll do the nuclear thing if you'll leave our guy Assad alone. If that's what you're suggesting.